All right, so let's talk about arrays in C++. Now, an array is something that we use in most modern programming languages. Very, very common tool. And what we're going to look at here is really more specific to C++, but the concepts are broad ranging. And once you understand arrays in one language, we pretty much use them the same way in most languages. Python has a little bit different approach to how it uses arrays, but you'll cover that more if you're taking the Python course. But basically, to start out with, just the simple, understanding of what an array is. An array is a way that we can store multiple variables and then represent those variables as a single container. I like to think of it sort of as the bucket analogy. If we think of an array as a bucket, I can take that bucket and I can put a bunch of things in it, and now I have all of this stuff that I can represent as one single unit, as a bucket, and I can carry that bucket around in my code and do things with it, manipulate it. I can take things out of the bucket and then I can put things back into the bucket and so forth. So an array is a way that we can sort of take a variety of things, of elements or integers or strings or whatever we want, and we can represent those as a single unit. And that's pretty important to be able to do that for a variety of programs and different types of programs that you'll work with. So the purpose of using an array is efficiency, is simplifying code. Most of the things that we can do with arrays, we can do with variables. The problem is if you've got a bunch of different variables and you're trying to manipulate them in your code and pass them around, it gets overwhelming. And so what arrays really do for us is it simplifies that process. It simplifies our code and makes it easier for us to create those containers. Think of a spreadsheet, for example. If I were to create an Excel spreadsheet, all of the same things that I do with that spreadsheet, I can sort of break that apart and do individually with other tools, but it's nice to have that in one spreadsheet. I can crunch numbers, I can look at trends and things like that, and do a variety of things that I couldn't do if I didn't have that ability to represent a group of things as a singular unit. So when we talk about arrays, one of the main points of using an array is to be able to take types of data that are similar and that have something in common. For example, imagine you wanted to create a character in a game or something like that, and you wanted to set some parameters of the type of character, maybe their gender, maybe what type of character, if it's a warrior with a sword or something like that. You might want to set colors and so on and so forth. So we can take those and we want to be able to put that together as a package and be able to pass that around, and that's where that container comes into play. But we generally tend to work with similar things. For example, if we're working with an integer or integers, we want to remember what an integer is. It's basically a number that we can do calculations with. And so you'll see an example here pretty quick that we can write a program that does multiplication, other types of mathematical calculations and so forth. But say we have maybe a baseball team and we want to store the list of players' names in an array. In that case, we have a string. And remember what a string is. It's basically text, character. We're not necessarily going to do calculations with it and so forth. So we tend to think of those containers as holding similar types of things, and logically it makes sense in our program to approach it in that way. So here's a couple of examples with C++, similar process to most programming languages. The syntax may be different, maybe a slightly different approach if you're dealing with Python, maybe a couple of different ways of doing it there. But In general, the first thing that we need to do is declare our array. And remember what we mean by declare. We're creating the array by declaring the array. So if you'll notice here in the center under the syntax, we have the type, we have the name, and then we have the size of the array that we're going to create. So the next step once we create our array is we want to initialize it. And remember, when we initialize anything, whether it's a variable or array, we're assigning a value to it. So if we create a variable and maybe that variable is name, we haven't assigned a value for the name. We just have a variable that's going to hold that name. Now the value of a variable is to be able to put different names into that slot without changing the logic of our code. If we have a loop structure, for example, we can take that variable that we've set up that's called name, and we can put that into our loop structure. And now when we change the value of that variable, we don't have to go in and change our loop structure, because the logic of it is the same. We're simply referring to the name of the variable, but as we take values and insert into that variable, we get different results in our loop structure. Same thing with working with arrays, but with an array, remember, we have multiple values in our container. So when we initialize it, we have to look at the size of the array. And one thing that trips people up very often when you're working with arrays is sort of like a spreadsheet. You have an index number that represents the values in your arrays, and typically that starts at 0. So when I say I have an array here where I'm pointing with my mouse, notice I've got the number 5. That sets the number of elements I can put into my array. So if I want to initialize that and actually put the values in, you can count up those 5 elements. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But one thing to keep in mind is with the index number, we start at 0. So the first item in the array is going to start with an index of 0. So it's 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And there's my 5 elements. There's a couple of different ways that we can initialize the values in our array. Notice down here at the bottom, I'm initializing a particular single item within that array, or single element within that array. And notice here it says the above statement assigns element number 5th in the array with a value of 200. Remember, we're starting at 0, so in our array we're specifying 4, or that fourth index slot there. So here's a quick example, simple example of an array in C++. Notice I've got my input output, I've got my standard namespace here, and so forth, and I've got an int integer that I've called numbers. So the name of my array is going to be numbers, and I'm going to have 5 items in that. And I initialize a variable there at 0. And then I'm prompting with that cout the user to enter those 5 numbers. So from here, we're going to pop this into a loop. Notice we've got our typical incrementation. So I'm starting out with the int I equals 0. I'm starting out at 0 because I'm going to loop through as long as I is less than 5. Remember, we're going to start out at 0 with our index number, and this double plus right here is our incrementation. So it's telling it loop through under these circumstances, continue to iterate through that until I is equal to 5, because it's got to be less than equal or less than 5 in order to increment to the next loop cycle. So now in this case down here, we're just summing those together, and our end result is going to be the result of that calculation. That's what that plus equals is there. So we can sum those numbers together, and then we should get our end result. You can pop this into the C++ shell and test it if you want to, but this is a real simple, good example of how we can create an array by declaring it. We can set the number of elements in our array. We can assign values, if you look at the previous slides, and we can get those values out of the array and do something with them, multiply them, add them, do something like that. In this case, they're integers. If it's a string array, then I might not be doing calculations, but I might simply be using that to reference maybe the properties of maybe a character in a game or something like that. So hopefully this gets you started with arrays. They're really not difficult to understand. The logic is sound as far as it makes sense in your code what you can do with arrays. But what people get, what they struggle with sometimes is just simply, how do I create the array? How do I manipulate it? How do I get access to those those values in the array in a way that I can do something with them in my code? So hopefully this will get you up and running and started using arrays.